Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Looks like I need to update the year. We are now in 2023. So welcome everyone to the new year. This is our first webinar for the year. We're really excited to have Laura here. If you are new, if this is your first webinar in our series, welcome. If you're not familiar with the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative, we are a network of organizations throughout the state and regionally working together for coordinated bird conservation. There are around 120 organizations in the network, ranging from state and federal wildlife agencies to universities, museums, metro parks. Basically, any organization interested in avian conservation, we welcome them to join our network. So if you're joining us today from an organization in Ohio or nearby, reach out to us and let us know if you'd like to get involved. You can visit our website, obcinet.org, and learn more about us. Hopefully this is not your first webinar and you've been joining us over the course of the last year. We had 6 presenters last year and we're hoping to fill up the rest of the calendar this year as well. We're planning on doing these every other month. If you have ideas about programs that you'd like to see in the future, please get in touch with us. You can email me at obcicoordinator@gmail.com, and we would love to know what you're interested in learning about. For today's program, we encourage you to use the chat and Q&A feature. If you just want to chat with other attendees today or have some general comments, feel free to add those in the chat. If you have questions for Laura at any time today, you can use the Q&A feature. So everybody should be able to have access to that. If for some reason it's not working, sometimes Zoom settings don't always like to play nice, let me know in the chat and we'll get that sorted out. But you can enter your questions there. And I've also turned on the upvote functionality. So if you see a question that somebody else asked that you're interested in, you can upvote that and that'll move it to the top of the queue. We should have plenty of time at the end of today's program to get to all of your questions. If for some reason Laura has really sparked your minds and generated a lot of questions, we can share some contact information and address those afterwards as well. Just a reminder, if for some reason you need to leave early, all of our programs are recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel, and those are indexed on our website. So if you go to obcinet.org, click on the resources tab and choose webinars, you'll be able to find a list of upcoming programs and information on all of the past programs that we've done, including links to YouTube recordings. So without further ado, I would like to introduce today's presenter. I've been fortunate to work with Laura Kearns for the last 14 or so years on various bird conservation efforts. She is a wildlife biologist with the ODNR-Division of Wildlife. And today she's going to talk to us about sandhill crane recovery and the current status of the species here in Ohio. So without further ado, I'll stop sharing and turn it over to Laura.
Great, thanks, Matt. All right, can everybody see that screen?
Yep, looking good.
And I'm just going to move it once to see what happens. No, it's not moving.
No.
Okay, let's try this again. About now, do you see that moving?
You're not sharing your screen.
Oh. Okay. All right.
Yes, there we go.
It's moving now. Okay, there we go.
3 years into Zoom, and someday we're going to get this.
Okay, I guess it's like starting over every time you have a new person, but
Yep.
All right, here we go.
All right.
All right, so yeah, today I'm going to talk about sandhill cranes, and they are one of our species that has recovered here in the last 20 to 30 years here in the state. So I'm going to talk about that recovery and also about the current population status and a little bit of other research that we've done with the species. But first, I want to talk about what is so special about sandhill cranes. So first of all, they're one of Ohio's largest bird species, so that makes them relatively easy to view. They're somewhat more conspicuous than a lot of other species. And because they were gone and then have come back, it's also been exciting to see them, their numbers grow and expand throughout the state. And I'll talk more about that, of course. And then some other interesting things is they also have an interesting life history. They are a migratory species and have been documented going as far south as Florida. And now that we're going, I'm going to turn off my camera and so you can focus on the slides. Okay. Okay. So on this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about natural history and life cycle, recovery and current status, and also talk about ways that you can help monitor cranes. And then again, like I said, talk about the migration and wintering study of Ohio's sandhill cranes. Okay, so sandhill cranes, scientific name is Antigone canadensis. It's actually the genus recently changed from Grus to Antigone. And like I said, one of the largest birds in Ohio. The males can weigh up to 12 pounds, females up to 10 pounds. So that's pretty big for a bird. Their wingspan is anywhere from 6 to 6.5 feet. And their height can range from about 3.5 feet to almost 4 feet in height, but that's somewhat variable depending on how they hold their head. And then I just wanted to mention that the subspecies of sandhill crane that we see here in Ohio is Antigone canadensis tabata, which is commonly known as the greater sandhill crane. And another unique thing is their lifespan is up to 35 years. That's about the longest it has so far been documented in the wild. Okay, moving on to their habitat and their food. Well, they are a wetland dependent species, and that's one reason we don't have a lot of sandhill cranes in Ohio, because we unfortunately lost up to 90 to 95% of our wetlands over the last couple hundred years. So the fact that they are coming back is a testament to some of our wetland protections and wetland recovery. But they also depend on upland habitats, and they will be seen foraging in farm fields. They love corn, so they love to go into those ag fields after they've been harvested and look for corn that's laying in the fields. But they're omnivores, so they'll eat a lot of different types of food. Along with grains, they'll eat a lot of wetland plants. They'll eat wetland invertebrates, small fish, frogs. So they're quite adaptable in what they can eat. So just to orient you to their identification. So in the upper photo there, that's a sandhill crane. And they are primarily a gray bird. But what's distinctive is the red crown that you see on the top of their head. So both the male and the female have this. So that's, if you see a big gray bird, look for that red, and that will help you identify it as a sandhill crane. The species that it's most likely to be confused with is the great blue heron. And the great blue heron is a little bit different from sandhill crane. Excuse me. The heron is another wetland species, but they're much more common. They differ from the sandhill crane in terms of identification in the fact that they don't have that red top on their head, and they also tend to have different postures from the sandhill. So the crane in the photo above, you see its neck kind of outstretched, but the great blue heron below has its neck bent, and it's a little more characteristic to see its neck in that position. So even when flying, they'll keep those same sort of postures. So the sandhill crane, when it's flying, its neck will be outstretched, whereas the great blue heron will keep its neck bent. And that's one of the best ways to tell the difference between them, especially when they're flying. There's also some differences in their social behavior. So sandhill cranes, when they're nesting, they are territorial nesters. They will be in pairs and kind of patrolling the territory around their nest, which is usually located on the ground. The great blue heron, on the other hand, is a colonial nester. So they actually nest in trees with other great blue herons and sometimes other wading bird species like great egrets, double-crested cormorants, and black-crowned night herons. So they'll be in like a mixed waterbird colony. But interestingly, they tend to go off from those colonies and then maintain a solitary foraging territory. So that's why a lot of times when you see them around like creeks and rivers and lakes, they're just kind of hanging out by themselves, and that's because they've kind of set a foraging territory that they keep control of. So anyway, those are some of the major differences between sandhill cranes and great blue herons. The other bird I want to mention is the whooping crane, and the sandhill crane and the whooping crane are the only two native North American crane species. However, they look quite different. The whooping crane is white. So very distinctively different in that respect. Whooping cranes are still very rare here in Ohio. They definitely are not breeding here. Breeding populations are in Wisconsin and then south in like Louisiana and Florida. Those have all been reintroduced breeding populations. So occasionally we'll get some migrants coming through more in the western part of the state, but it's still quite unusual when that happens. But I just want you to be aware of that species as well. So crane breeding phenology, just talk about what kind of we expect starting in March of the year, which is now. So this is a great time. A lot of the cranes have come back to their breeding territories and they're performing their courtship rituals to kind of cement those pair bonds with their mates and reestablish their territories. So one thing that they do to do that is they dance. So these two photos here are some examples of cranes dancing. So they literally jump up in the air and they outstretch their wings and they bob their heads up and down, and that is all part of the springtime ritual. They will do it other times of year as well, and they're not really sure why. Maybe they're just practicing, but in the spring when they're doing it, it's usually with their partner alone, and that's again forging that pair bond. So once they've got their mate bond reestablished and their territory measured out, staked out, then they start nesting. And they'll nest on the ground in a fairly large nest, and they typically lay 2 eggs. And then they incubate that nest for about 30 days. And then come April or May, those chicks hatch, depending on when the nest was started. And this right here is a chick that is relatively freshly hatched. It's probably been out for about a day, given it time to let those feathers dry off from the fluid in the egg. Sometimes both chicks will hatch. It just kind of depends on the year and the pair, how experienced they are. Sometimes depends on how many they have. So those chicks hatch, but they grow up pretty quickly. So within about 2 months, they are pretty much the same size as their parents, and they are ready to fledge. During that 2-month period, the family all stay together. The parents help feed the young, teach them how to forage and hunt. So there's a very strong kind of family bond during that time. But yeah, 60 days in, they're ready to start flying on their own. So once late summer, early fall approaches, the birds are starting to think about migration. And so over these next few slides, I'm going to use maps from eBird to kind of show how the sandhill crane, the sandhill cranes kind of use the eastern part of North America throughout their breeding season and the rest of their life cycle. So just to orient you to some colors. So first of all, the purple here represents areas where cranes are found year round. And that does include parts of Ohio, but we also see a lot of migration through the state. Red areas indicate areas that are just primarily breeding habitat for cranes. Blue represents the non-breeding or wintering season. So you can see that area tends to go all the way down into Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and into Florida. And then these other areas, the green and the yellow, represent areas that are typically, cranes are only found in transition between those breeding and wintering grounds. So anyway, here in Ohio, we're kind of a mix of birds passing through, but also some may stay for the winter, and then we also have breeding. So we're kind of a mixed bag here in Ohio, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later when I talk about some of the migration studies that we did. But going back to the full life cycle after those juveniles have grown up, the juveniles are really dependent on learning migration behavior from their parents. It's not necessarily innate. So they really stick together in that family unit until the next spring, learning the migration to and from their breeding and wintering areas. During this time, a lot of this is regulated by photoperiod. And so they will go through something called migratory restlessness as the days get shorter. And so they start kind of migrating in some different places. Sometimes they'll actually go south a little bit, and then they'll go back north, and that's called a false migration before they take the final journey to the south. Also, what's really important for sandhill cranes is that they have staging areas. So these are areas where all the cranes in the population tend to kind of come together in a big flock before they head further south for the winter. In terms of staging areas here in Ohio, probably the areas most likely to be considered staging areas are Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge in that part of Northwest Ohio. But otherwise, Indiana tends to be a really important area for staging cranes in the Midwest. There are some places in southern Michigan, but the most famous place is Jasper-Pulaski. I believe it's a wildlife area in northwestern Indiana. And usually in November, you get tens of thousands of cranes coming together there before they head south for the winter. Okay, so in terms of winter then, so not all the birds, at least here in Ohio, leave. We get some that stay here year round. It depends on winter weather conditions. And then we have some that head south. So where do they go in the south? Well, so like I said, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but again, they're heading down if it's a cold winter into Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and potentially down to Florida. And then in the spring, the juveniles return north with their parents and then disperse, potentially to hang out with other non-breeding cranes. Sometimes cranes don't breed until they reach 5, 6, 7, 8 years of age. So they're hanging out with non-breeding cranes during that time. Okay, so I'm going to talk specifically about the eastern population of sandhill cranes. So Ohio is considered, there's 6 different sort of flyway populations of cranes, and our cranes that breed here in Ohio are part of the eastern population. And this particular population was nearly extirpated in the 1930s. We lost cranes from Ohio and then other places throughout the Midwest. So this population started to come back though, when they started keeping track of the population. In 1986, they had 17,043 birds. in the last, 35 years, that population has almost grown tenfold. The last survey conducted in the fall of 22 estimated the population at 107,140 birds. And even this was a 19% increase from 2021. So we've really been seeing some phenomenal growth in the population. However, here in Ohio, the sandhill crane is still listed as state threatened. And on that same survey in 2022, we only counted 199 birds. So we are, which is a lot for us, but again, in comparison to the rest of the population, we still have just a sliver of the entire eastern population of sandhill cranes. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's happened here in Ohio. So like I said, they were extirpated from Ohio in 1926. At least that was the last nesting record in Ohio. And that was in Huron Bog and Huron County, so just south of Sandusky, Ohio. And then no cranes breeding, at least for the next 50 to 60 years. But in 1987, we had our first new record of breeding, and this was in a different area of the state in Wayne County, Ohio. So this is near Worcester, Ohio. So since that time, the Division of Wildlife has been trying our best to monitor breeding sandhill crane populations. And in recent years, as the population has continued to expand, it's become a little more challenging to keep track of them. So we use some different methods. We have a wildlife reporting website where staff and citizens can report breeding sandhill cranes. So we like to get reports of if someone has found a sandhill crane nest or has observed a pair with chicks or young juveniles. That's helpful information for us. Certainly eBird has become a much more popular way of people reporting their bird sightings. So we also make use of that to help track our populations. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service do a fall crane count across the Midwest and Canada. And so that has become also an important way to track not necessarily the breeding populations, but at least the overall eastern sandhill population. And that's done typically the last week of October. We typically do that when our division staff are doing our fall waterfowl survey. So we do that from the plane, fly over and count cranes over some of our major waterfowl production areas, which are also major crane production areas. So this is kind of the best representation we have of sandhill crane population and productivity from about the mid-90s to 2021. So we've done our best to track breeding pairs throughout the state. And so the light lines with the light blue triangles, that's representing breeding pairs. And that number, as of 2021, had gotten up to about 80, 85 breeding pairs. It's been a lot harder to track the number of young. That's not something that people report all the time on eBird. And so in recent years, that number has not really stayed caught up with the number of breeding pairs. And I just think that's an artifact of not being able to get the reports of those chicks. But still, we are continually getting reports of chicks throughout time. And again, we're still continuing to see the breeding population expand. So that's all a good sign. So I mentioned some of the challenges with tracking during the breeding season. So a couple years ago, along with some instigation from the International Crane Foundation, which is a nonprofit dedicated to the conservation of the world's cranes, we decided to start an Ohio crane count, which is a citizen science-driven survey. So we did a pilot season in Ohio in 2021, and then I was just in a few counties in the state, and then we did a full survey last year in April of 2022, and then we're planning to continue with that in 2023. So just a little bit about that. The Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative has also been an important partner in coordinating this survey. So there's more information about it on the OBCI website, and I'll talk about that more at the end. But if you're interested in the International Crane Foundation and how they do their count, you can go to savingcranes.org. Typically, we do this the second or third Saturday in April. It kind of depends on when Easter falls every year. And it is volunteer driven, so it's volunteers going out and helping to count. This year, we're going to survey approximately 30 counties, primarily in northern and central Ohio. And again, I'll give you some more information about this at the end of the talk. So the results from the last couple years of the crane count, yeah, as you can see, we surveyed a lot of different counties. I've highlighted the top 5 counties from 2022. So Geauga County was one of the hotspots for cranes. We had 45 cranes there last year. They were also one of our pilot counties, so we had 34 the year before. So showed potentially a little bit of growth here, or maybe we just had better effort in 2022. Another hotspot was Lucas County, and Geauga, for those of you not familiar with it, is up in Northeast Ohio, just east of the Cleveland area. Lucas County, they had 47 cranes. Lucas County is where Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge is, up in Northwest Ohio. Another location, Ottawa County, is just adjacent to Lucas County, 17 cranes there. And then Trumbull County over in Northeast Ohio had 22. That is on the border with Pennsylvania. And then finally, Wayne County was our top county. This is the county, Worcester, Ohio. If you're familiar with Killbuck Wildlife Area or Funk Bottoms Wildlife Area, those two areas right there are hotspots for cranes. And I suspect there is a lot of breeding going on in those areas, but I suspect we get a lot of cranes overwintering there. It is likely a hangout for some of those non-breeding cranes that haven't yet formed breeding territories. And then just to give you that geographic perspective here, again, Lucas and Ottawa counties right up here in Northwest Ohio, Wayne County in North Central Ohio, Geauga and Trumbull counties in Northeast Ohio. And then we really had a pretty good showing last year. Just a lot of these other counties, a lot of them don't have a lot of cranes, but they have at least 1 or 2 pairs of cranes. And that's really encouraging. It's an indication that we've got good habitat on the ground in those counties, and they're finding opportunities to potentially breed. So good to see that expansion, not just having high numbers in these, primary counties, but just good to see them expanding throughout the state. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up this talk talking a little bit about a study we did tracking cranes, trying to understand their migration and wintering behaviors a little bit better. So this was started before I came on with the division by Dave Sherman, who's still works for the Division of Wildlife, but in a different role. And then Jason Tucker and Bob Gates through Ohio State University. And I kind of came on, we were finishing up the study. But what we were doing, we're putting satellite transmitters on cranes, and we were able to fit 22 birds with satellite transmitters. And with that, we were able to document 36 migratory journeys. So sometimes we were able to get multiple years, multiple journeys out of the same bird. So this photo right here is of one that we captured once I had started with the division in August of 2014. So just going to compare some of the behaviors we saw with the eBird maps that I was showing you earlier. This one is focused on the left here is focused on the fall migration patterns of sandhill cranes. And then on the right, these are 5 of our birds that migrated in the fall of 2014. And so just kind of showing that we get our birds here in Ohio pretty much, you know, a lot of them went over to Indiana and Kentucky, flew west and then south. And we had a couple that kind of just went straight to the south, crossing over the mountains. For the most part, it seems like sandhill cranes like to avoid big obstacles to migration. So they don't really like flying over large bodies of water like the Great Lakes. And they also don't really like flying over big mountain chains. So again, this tendency for a lot of them to fly a little bit to the west and then south so they can avoid flying through the mountains. So during this time, we also identified some key stopover sites or staging areas for the cranes that fly through Ohio or start here in Ohio. One area was Muscatatuck National Wildlife Refuge in Indiana. So that's a good spot for going to see cranes in the winter. And then another spot is Hiawassee Wildlife Refuge, is a state wildlife refuge in Tennessee. And that's a huge, sometimes it's a staging area, and then other times it acts more like a wintering area. Again, thousands of cranes spend significant chunks of time here in the winter months. So that's just north of Chattanooga. And then, you know, there were other various stopover sites throughout Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee that the birds would use on their way south. So kind of just pulling us all together, pulling in the eBird map showing the distribution of the eastern population of sandhill cranes, and then the majority of the migratory routes from our study. Again, it's Ohio's birds are pretty much tracking what we see with the eBird data. And it was interesting during that time of that study just to see how the birds distributed themselves during the winter. Florida ended up being the location where the highest number of birds went. So we had, and again, this is not necessarily birds, but again, migratory journeys. So during that time, about 31% went down to Florida. That was 11 different journeys. Tennessee, 28%. That was 10 different journeys. Ohio, 28% tended to stay in Ohio. And then we had a few that went to Kentucky, and then a couple that went down to Georgia. And so interestingly, this study now, it was the last bird was tagged in 2014. I mean, it's been 8 years, but during that 8-year time period, I feel like we've continued to see our winters getting milder and milder. And I suspect that if we were to do this study again, we would see more and more of our birds just staying in Ohio for the winter. So I just wanted to show some of the wintering habitat. So we had in 2014, we had one bird go to Florida. And interestingly, I went to a part of Florida where I had previously worked and lived earlier in my career. And so I thought, hey, I'll go down and visit some of my, just for fun, go down, visit some of my old colleagues down there and see if I can potentially track this crane. And I went down, and this area is kind of known for producing horticultural products like caladiums. And so the cranes were just hanging out in these fields, probably eating some of the horticultural products that people didn't want them to eat. But nonetheless, there were thousands and thousands of cranes here. Other uses of this habitat were for cattle ranching. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but Florida is actually, at least 15 years ago, was the #1 producer of cattle east of the Mississippi. So a lot of ranch land down in Florida. And the cranes were hanging out there as well. They feel kind of protected. There's a lot of waterways. They can kind of hang out there, lots of grass to eat, insects, things like that to forage on in the fields. So that's just a snapshot of what the wintering habitat down there looks like. So going back to what our birds did in the spring, yeah, for the most part, they retrace their routes. Interestingly, this yellow one here that went down to Florida, in the fall, it had pretty much tracked straight down to Florida, but in the spring, it took a more leisurely journey back and stopped at some of the same stopover areas that the others did, and kind of joined up with the rest and flocked back to Ohio. But what was also interesting was that we had a couple birds that were captured here in Ohio that went further north into Michigan and Ontario. So just let you look at those pathways a little more closely. So this white bird flew, we caught it in Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. It flew all the way down to Georgia, spent the winter down there, and then tracked back slowly back up. But then it really didn't come back to Ohio. It went all the way back up to Michigan. And then this other one over here depicted in blue, it was also, we caught it in either Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge or McGee Marsh, kind of same area as the other one, but it went down and only wintered as far south as Hiwassee in Tennessee. And then it kind of tracked back a pretty similar way back in the spring, and then ended up going back into Ontario. So neither of these birds decided to stay. And so what was happening here? Well, first, I'll just do a little aside here, is that generally cranes have really high site fidelity. So breeders tend to return within 2 kilometers of their previous breeding territory. And this was some work that Jason Tucker did published his thesis in 2014. Some of the birds that he had tracked earlier on, they had come right back to their previous year's breeding territory. So an example of this was Z44, depicted in the pink here. We tracked this bird for multiple years, and despite going to Georgia, it went all the way to Florida one year, and then Tennessee another, but every year it was coming back to the same, or approximately the same location in the Funk Bottoms, Kilbuck Wildlife Area region. So the thing about these 2 birds is both of them were hatch year birds. And so because cranes tend to stick with their families up until that first spring after they hatch, I suspect that these birds are probably just passing through, or were doing a false migration when we captured them up here in the Lake Erie marshes, and that they followed their families back to their natal territories in Ontario and Michigan. So unfortunately, their satellite tags didn't last long enough for us to get multiple successive journeys, but still, it was interesting to see the different patterns and to see that we had, like I said earlier, I think that Ottawa, McGee Marsh area may be kind of a fall staging area early on in migration for sandhill cranes. The last one I want to talk about, we did have one of those hatchier birds that did return to Ohio. We tracked this one for about 1.5 years. And we also caught it up in the Lake Erie marshes, but then it came back to Ohio the first spring, which is in the darker orange right here. It came back pretty much to the same area where we captured it. And then the following spring, following winter, didn't go as far south, only went down into Kentucky, and then came back, went up into Michigan, and of course decided that Michigan wasn't suitable, and came right back to Ohio, and then spent that next spring at Winus Point Marsh Conservancy. So yeah, just every bird's a little bit different. So just to leave you with some concluding thoughts about Ohio's sandhills, generally we continue to see growth and expansion of the Sandhill crane populations here in Ohio. And we have programs right now in Ohio. The H2 Ohio program is really putting more and more wetland habitat on the ground. So I can't help but think that that is going to continue to support the growth and expansion of that population. Ohio also serves as an important migratory corridor for the eastern population. I know we get a lot of reports of sandhill cranes flying over, particularly in the western part of the state. I don't think all of those birds are Ohio's cranes, but I think birds are passing through from Michigan and further north. And I think habitat is really key to keeping cranes here in Ohio, specifically for breeding. But we also need to protect important migratory stopover areas and wintering habitat. So yeah, I'll just finish up here to tell you a little bit more about the Ohio crane count, which is coming up. So this year, the count is going to be on Saturday, April 15th. And it's an relatively early morning count because that's when the cranes are most vocal, most active. You're most likely to see them. So that's from 6:30 to 8:30 a.m. Right now, we have most of our county coordinators already selected, but we have a few counties that I've listed below here that we're still kind of looking for people to help. And the function of the coordinator is to help recruit and assign volunteers to survey blocks and then survey those blocks as needed. The counties we're looking for still are Ashland, Mahoning, Richland, and Stark counties. In Northwest Ohio, Fulton and Williams County. And then in Central Ohio, Morrow, Pickaway, and Wyandotte County. And it helps if you, you are familiar with those counties and areas where you might see sandhill cranes. If you have some experience with eBird, that's also really helpful. So if you're interested, contact Matt at obcicoordinator@gmail.com. But if you're just interested in just going out for the morning to help count some cranes, yeah, always looking for volunteers to get involved. So if you are interested in doing that, then find the county, your county or the county nearest you on the obcinet.org website. We have the Ohio Crane Count under the Get Involved tab. Again, we're doing like 20 different counties in central and northern Ohio. So you can find one that might hopefully be your county or one close to you and come on out and help out. So, so with that, like I said, to continue helping cranes and learning more about them, you can participate in the Ohio Crane Count. You can, like I said before, it's tracking those chicks, which we refer to as colts, specifically for cranes. We also have the wildlife reporting website, which the link is right here. So usually like May, June, July, when those colts become more visible, that's a good time to kind of keep an eye out for them. And then finally, just supporting wetland and wildlife conservation. There's just so many different ways that you can do this, but two means for directly contributing to wetland preservation is through the purchase of the Ohio Wetlands Habitat Stamp or the federal duck stamp. And there's also a lot of ways that you can contribute to wildlife diversity in general through purchasing of a wildlife legacy stamp. This is an example of one of those right here in the corner. We also have specialty license plates. You can do a tax checkoff or donations, and or you can contribute to the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative Development Fund. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions, and thanks so much for listening.
That was great, Laura. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
We do have at least one question in the chat here. So everyone else, I encourage you, if you have questions that you've thought up during the presentation, now's the time to add those to the Q&A. First up, John Kohler asks, after spring migration, do the adults chase out young from the previous year out of the area?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am assuming that they do because you don't see more than a couple cranes hanging around once they're getting serious about nesting. I would think that just from a camouflage or keeping the new nest safe and the new chicks safe, they don't want those other cranes hanging around. So yeah, I personally haven't observed that behavior, but yes, that has to be what they do. And maybe it's just like, our teenage kids who they just get to that point where they just don't want to have anything to do with their parents, and maybe they just take off on their own. But yeah, one of the two, if not both.
Cool. Well, I have a couple questions, so I'll go ahead and ask. In recent years, there's been a lot more attention to full annual cycle ecology and carryover effects based on, habitat and resources on the wintering ground and stopover habitats. Have you seen any linkages between differences in overwintering habitats that potentially carry over to the birds that breed here with, more young, or the young are surviving, or so on and so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure if anybody has looked at that. I know we haven't looked at that here in the state. Again, it would you'd have to be both tracking the birds through satellite telemetry or some other telemetry effort, as well as then tracking their productivity on the ground. Yeah. I think that would be a really interesting question, given that they do have they can have variable migration stopover areas. I mean, I just found it fascinating that we were tracking some of the same individuals over a couple different years, and they would do something completely different in a different year. And it seems like that's most likely tied into weather and temperature, but there could be other things at play there as well. But yeah, I think that's a great question, and it would be interesting to see whether there are already differences depending on where they winter for the year.
Well, if we have any potential graduate students joining us today, maybe think about that as a question and talk to Laura and other folks about potential projects. So we've got a few more questions here. George asks, what are the chief predators of sandhill cranes?
Yeah, great question. It somewhat depends on where the birds are as to what the major predators are. But here in Ohio, I would say things like coyotes, bobcats, potentially as the bobcats are expanding more. Some of your, like when the chicks are really young, or you have nest predators, raccoons could be an issue. They are nesting on the ground. Mink could be an issue. So any of those mesocarnivore or other typical mammalian carnivores could be a problem. Some birds, golden eagles, we don't have a ton of golden eagles here in Ohio, but those can take some of the larger cranes. Not really bald eagles, I don't think. I think bald eagles prefer ducks on the water as opposed to cranes in the fields. But yeah, those would be some of your at least ones here in Ohio. But it down in Florida, it's things like alligators. Those can be a big problem in places like Florida. Yeah,
cool. All right. Well, August Froelich has asked, do you have an idea about how large the home ranges are for nesting sandhill cranes here in Ohio?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, Jason Tucker did some work specifically on this. I haven't looked at those data for a while, but they could be like half a mile to a mile, square mile. Again, I think it depends on the habitat and how big the habitat size is. I mean, we'll see them, in places where there's a lot of wetland area on the ground, like Killbuck Wildlife Area, Funk Bottoms Wildlife Area, you know, we'll definitely have multiple cranes nesting in the area. But then those places where you just have a pair here and a pair there, you know, it may just depend, is there a good mix of wetland habitat and upland habitat that can support them, and but also keep them safe from predators. So the classic answer is it depends, but they can get quite large.
Okay. We have one more question in the chat. Mary Ellen asks, does Michigan participate in the crane count, or do they have a similar count if they wanted to instruct some friends and family to get involved?
Yeah, let me just double check the ICF website real quick. The answer is, I think so.
I think they participate.
Yeah, I do. Just gonna. The short answer is yes. It's not going to come to me quickly enough. But yes, I can get back to, wait. I think, yes, Michigan does. Yeah. So if you go to the ICF website, savingcranes.org, and search for Midwest Crane Count, there are multiple counties with county coordinators listed. So yes, and Michigan would be a great place to count cranes because there's a lot up there.
Mm-hmm. All right, we do another question that popped up in the Q&A box. So Peg asks, when will a volunteer training take place? Yeah,
that's a great question. We haven't set a specific date for a webinar yet. Probably we were planning to do that maybe next week or the week after. But in the meantime, we have actually done some recordings of PowerPoints that basically should have everything you need to know to get started. So those are up on the OBCI website now. So you can always take a look at those and review those. We also have the protocol posted, on the website. So, yeah, if you're interested, go ahead and take a look at those, and then we will be working with the county coordinators to get at least one live webinar / question and answer period scheduled in the next week or two.
Yeah, our hope is moving forward that we can use these pre-recorded videos or update them so that they're good enough that people can take the training on their own time and their own schedule. And then, you know, if we have questions, like Laura mentioned, we'll have a live Q&A session for folks. So do take a look at those videos. They should cover everything. But if you have questions after that, write those down, get in touch with your county coordinator. And then lastly, if we still have questions to answer, we'll try to put together a Q&A session one evening. Well, Laura, it looks like that's it for our questions. Thank you for a very good presentation. Pretty excited about spring and the crane count. So encourage everyone to check out the crane count website. Go to the ICF page and the divisions page as well. Thank you for joining us, and we will let you know about a webinar likely sometime in May. So thanks, everyone.